Your turbocharger spins at over 150,000 RPM on a film of oil thinner than a human hair, and every cold morning, most Ford owners do something that starves it of that oil for those critical first seconds. I have been a Ford technician for over 15 years, and I have cut open dozens of failed EcoBoost turbos that all told the same story: bearing damage that started the moment the key turned. Today I am exposing 7 cold start habits that are quietly killing your turbo. Number 2 has destroyed more EcoBoost turbos than any mechanical defect ever has. Let us start with the one almost everyone is guilty of, and it is the most expensive mistake you can make on a cold day. Habit 7 is flooring it within the first 30 seconds of a cold start. You're running late, you fire up your F-150, and before the oil pressure has even climbed, you're already mashing the throttle to merge onto the highway. This single habit does more damage to your turbo bearings than months of normal driving. Here's what's actually happening inside that turbo. When your engine has been sitting overnight, the oil has drained down out of the turbo's center bearing housing and pooled in the oil pan. The bearings are essentially dry. When you start the engine, the oil pump has to push cold, thick oil through narrow passages all the way up to the turbo before those bearings get any protection at all. In freezing temperatures, that oil moves like molasses, and the delay before full lubrication reaches the bearings can be several seconds. Now picture what happens when you floor it during those seconds. The turbo, which barely spins at idle, suddenly gets a blast of hot exhaust gas slamming into the turbine wheel. The shaft accelerates toward astronomical RPMs, while the bearings are still running on barely a film of oil. That is metal-to-metal contact at speeds the turbo was never designed to survive without lubrication. Turbo manufacturers have a saying that running a turbo without oil for 5 seconds does as much damage as running the whole engine without oil for 5 minutes. The bearings are the most vulnerable part of the entire engine because they spin faster and run hotter than anything else, which means they fail first when oil delivery is delayed. I have torn down turbos from trucks with barely 70,000 miles where the journal bearings showed the telltale discoloration of heat damage. Those blue and bronze tempering colors that mean the metal got so hot it literally changed color. The owners had no idea. The truck still drove fine, just with a little less power and a faint whistle they had learned to ignore. The fix costs you nothing but patience. After a cold start, give the engine 15 to 30 seconds before you pull away, and then drive gently for the first few minutes. Keep the RPM under 2,500 and stay out of boost until the temperature gauge starts to move off cold. You are not babying the truck for no reason. You are giving the oil time to reach the bearings and thin out enough to actually protect them. Do this every single cold morning and your turbo will outlast the rest of the engine. Habit 6 is shutting the engine off the second you arrive, especially after a hard drive. This is the cold start habit's evil twin, and it sets up damage that shows itself on the next cold start. When you drive a turbocharged Ford hard, that turbine housing glows. The turbo runs at exhaust gas temperatures that can exceed 900 degrees. The oil flowing through the bearings is doing double duty, lubricating and carrying heat away. When you pull into your driveway after climbing a hill or merging at speed and immediately kill the engine, the oil pump stops instantly, but the turbo is still spinning down and the housing is still blistering hot. That oil sitting stagnant in the bearing housing gets cooked. It bakes onto the bearing surfaces and the oil passages, forming hard carbon deposits in a process technicians call coking. Now here's how this connects to your cold start. Those carbon deposits build up inside the narrow oil feed passages that supply the turbo. Over time, they restrict the flow. So the next freezing morning, when your turbo already needs every drop of oil it can get during those vulnerable first seconds, the supply is choked down by carbon buildup from every hot shutdown you've done. You've created a double whammy: cold, thick oil struggling through passages that are now partially blocked, The bearings starve longer than they ever should. The fix is to let the engine idle for 30 seconds to a minute before shutdown after any spirited driving or a highway run. That idle keeps oil circulating through the turbo, pulling heat out of the bearings and letting the housing temperature drop to a safe range before the oil flow stops. On older turbo vehicles, enthusiasts used to install turbo timers for exactly this reason. You do not need one. You just need to sit for a moment before you turn the key. If you have been doing hot shutdowns for years, and you are now hearing a whine or noticing oil consumption, your turbo may already have coking damage in the bearings, and that is worth an inspection before it turns into a complete failure. Habit 5 is using the wrong oil viscosity for cold weather, or worse, running oil that is overdue for a change. Your owner's manual specifies an oil weight for a reason, and on EcoBoost engines, that spec is chosen partly to protect the turbo during cold starts. The first number in an oil rating, the part before the W, tells you how the oil flows when cold. A 5W30 flows far better at startup in freezing temperatures than a 10W30 because it stays thinner when cold. If you or a quick lube shop put in a heavier oil thinking thicker is somehow more protective, you have actually made the cold start oil delay to the turbo worse. Thicker cold oil takes longer to reach the bearings, which is the exact opposite of what you want on a January morning. But the bigger problem I see is owners running oil far past its service life. Old oil breaks down and gets contaminated, especially on direct injection EcoBoost engines, where fuel dilution is a known issue. When raw fuel washes past the rings and mixes into the oil, it thins the oil and destroys its protective film. Contaminated, degraded oil can't form the bearing film the turbo needs, and the gunk it carries can smear across bearing surfaces and even start blocking the oil feed passages. Roughly half of all turbo failures trace back to oil problems, either delayed lubrication or poor oil quality, and both of those are completely within your control. The fix is straightforward. Use the exact oil viscosity Ford specifies for your engine, a full synthetic, and change it on schedule or sooner if you do a lot of short trips or idling. Synthetic oil flows better when cold and resists the heat breakdown that coking causes, which means it protects your turbo at both ends, the cold start and the hot shutdown. This is the single cheapest insurance policy you have for your turbo, and skipping it is the most expensive shortcut you can take. Habit 4 is excessive cold idling to warm up the cabin. This one feels responsible, which is exactly why it is so common and so misunderstood. On a freezing morning, people start the truck, crank the heat, and let it idle in the driveway for 10, 15, sometimes 20 minutes to warm the interior before they get in. They think they are being kind to the engine. They are actually creating a perfect storm for the turbo. Here's the problem. At idle, the turbo barely spins, and the oil pressure feeding it is at its lowest. But the oil is still cold and thick because the engine warms up agonizingly slowly when it is just idling with no load. So the bearings are sitting in cold, sluggish oil at low pressure for an extended period. On top of that, prolonged idling lets unburned fuel wash into the oil, diluting it further and degrading the very lubricant the turbo depends on. There's another nasty mechanism at work. When the turbo spins slowly at idle for a long time, it can create a low pressure condition on the turbine side that lets oil seep past the seals into the housing. That is why turbos that idle a lot start consuming oil and smoking. If you're enjoying these insider explanations and want to keep your truck out of the shop, take a second to hit that subscribe button now, because the next 3 habits are the ones I see cause the most catastrophic wallet-emptying turbo failures. The fix is to forget the long warm-up entirely. Modern fuel-injected engines do not need to idle to warm up the way old carbureted engines did. The fastest and safest way to warm both the engine and the turbo is to start the truck. Wait 15 to 30 seconds for oil to reach the bearings, then drive away gently. Driving under light load brings the engine up to operating temperature far faster than idling ever will, which means the oil thins out and protects the turbo sooner. If you want a warm cabin, use your Ford remote start, which is designed to run a controlled warm-up cycle and shuts off automatically, rather than letting it sit and idle endlessly while you finish your coffee. Habit 3 is ignoring the oil pressure and temperature gauges entirely. Your Ford is trying to tell you exactly when the turbo is protected and when it is not, and most owners never glance at the information that matters. The temperature gauge on your dash is the single best tool you have for protecting your turbo on a cold start. When that needle is sitting at the cold mark, your oil is thick, your bearings are running on a marginal film, and your turbo is at its most vulnerable. That is your signal to stay out of boost. Drive gently, keep the throttle light, and do not demand power until the needle has climbed toward its normal operating position. Many owners treat the temperature gauge as nothing more than an overheating warning light, something they only look at if there is a problem. But the cold side of that gauge is just as important. On the trucks and SUVs with a digital oil pressure readout or a configurable gauge cluster, you can actually watch the oil pressure spike high on a cold start and then settle as the oil warms and thins. That high-cold reading is a reminder that the system is under stress and the oil is not yet doing its job properly at the bearings. The habit that destroys turbos is treating a stone-cold engine exactly the same as a fully warmed one, flooring it out of the driveway because the truck feels fine. It feels fine because turbo bearing damage is cumulative and silent. There is no warning light for a bearing that is slowly being worn down by repeated cold start abuse. By the time you get a check engine light or hear the whine, the damage is done. The fix costs you nothing. Build the habit of glancing at the temperature gauge every time you start cold. Cold needle means gentle driving and no boost. Needle off the cold mark means the oil is warm, the bearings are protected, and you can use the power you paid for. It is the simplest discipline in the world, and it is the difference between a turbo that dies at 90,000 miles and one that is still healthy at 200,000 miles. Habit 2 is the big one, revving the engine on a cold start to make it warm up faster. This is the habit that has destroyed more EcoBoost turbos than any factory defect ever could. And the cruel irony is that people do it believing they are helping. The logic seems sound. The engine is cold, so blip the throttle a few times to get the revolutions per minute up, get things moving, warm it up quicker. What you are actually doing is spinning a turbo with dry or barely lubricated bearings up to high speed at the exact moment it has the least protection it will ever have. Remember the timeline. On a cold start, the oil has drained out of the turbo overnight and the bearings are essentially dry. The pump needs those first seconds to push cold, thick oil up to the turbo. When you rev the engine in that window, the exhaust pulse slams into the turbine and the shaft rockets toward 100,000 revolutions per minute and beyond, all while the bearings are running on almost nothing. This is the textbook recipe for what technicians call oil starvation, and it causes direct metal-to-metal contact between the shaft and the journal bearings. The friction generates intense heat almost instantly. You get tempering discoloration on the shaft, material transferring between the bearing and the shaft, and in the worst cases, the shaft develops play or seizes entirely. Cold revving is uniquely destructive because it combines the two worst conditions at once, maximum bearing speed and minimum lubrication, in the same instant. A turbo that might survive years of gentle cold starts can be wrecked in a few thousand careless cold revs. I have seen the aftermath more times than I can count. Owners who habitually goose the throttle on cold mornings bring in trucks with worn turbos well before 100,000 miles, completely baffled because they maintained everything else. The fix is the easiest one on this entire list. Never rev a cold engine. Just start it, let it settle into idle, wait 15 to 30 seconds for oil to reach the bearings, and drive away gently. The engine will warm up faster from light driving than from any amount of revving in the driveway, and your turbo bearings will never know the abuse you used to put them through. If you've been a cold revver for years and you're now hearing any whining or whistling from the turbo that was not there before, get it inspected for shaft play, because that is the early warning of bearing damage that is already underway. Habit 1 is the most overlooked of them all. Repeated short, cold trips that never let the turbo or the oil fully warm up. This is the silent killer because no single trip feels like abuse, yet the pattern destroys turbos more reliably than almost anything else. Picture the typical routine: a 5-minute drive to drop the kids at school, a short hop to the store, a quick run to the gas station. Each of these trips, the engine starts cold, the turbo bearings go through that vulnerable low lubrication startup, and then you shut it off before the oil ever reaches full operating temperature. The oil never gets hot enough to burn off the moisture and fuel that accumulate in it during cold running. So the contamination just builds trip after trip. On direct injection EcoBoost engines, this is especially brutal because fuel dilution is already a known weakness, and short cold trips make it dramatically worse. The oil gets progressively thinner and dirtier, losing its ability to form a protective film exactly where the turbo needs it most. Meanwhile, every one of those cold starts subjects the bearings to that dry startup moment, and you are stacking dozens of them per week without ever giving the turbo the long, warm, sustained run it needs to clear everything out. The turbo bearings end up living their entire life in the worst possible conditions: cold, thick oil at startup followed by contaminated oil that never gets properly hot. Add a hot shutdown at the end of even one of those trips, and you have layered coking damage on top of starvation damage. The fix takes a little planning. If your driving is mostly short cold trips, change your oil more frequently than the owner's manual standard interval, because that oil is taking far more abuse than the schedule assumes. Whenever you can, combine errands into one longer trip so the engine and oil reach full operating temperature and stay there long enough to burn off contamination, ideally 20 minutes or more of sustained driving. And on every one of those short trips, still respect the cold start rules. Use gentle throttle and no boost until the temperature needle moves. None of this is hard. It's just a different way of thinking about how you use the truck. Take everything in this video to heart, and your turbo will reward you with a long, healthy life instead of a $5,000 surprise. So there you have it, the 7 cold start habits silently melting your Ford's turbo bearings. And the good news is that fixing every one of them costs you nothing but a little patience and awareness. Give it those first 30 seconds. Drive gently until the temperature gauge moves. Never rev or floor a cold engine. Let it idle briefly before a hot shutdown. Use the right synthetic oil and change it on time, and combine your short trips when you can. Do those things, and your turbo will outlast the rest of your truck. If this video saved you from an expensive mistake, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, tap the notification bell, and drop a comment telling me which of these habits you've been guilty of, because I read them all. And if you want to know the warning sounds your turbo makes right before it fails, the whines and whistles most owners ignore until it's too late, I've got a video on exactly that coming up next. I'll see you in that one.